This week I was thinking about Amos, and last week we wore the overalls, and we had a title on the message, a cotton-picking fig picker from South Dakota, who was a common, ordinary man. And we read in the book of Amos, from Amos chapter 7, speaking of himself, Amos said, "I am not a prophet, nor am I the son of a prophet. But I was a herdsman, a gatherer of the sycamore fruit." God spoke to this common, ordinary man in such a way and gave him a message that he was to take to the northern kingdom of Israel, about 10 to 12 miles away. And I thought about that this week. When I said those things last week, you and I, we think nothing of driving 10 to 12 miles. I think we're 31 miles one way to church. And we don't think a thing of that. But in those days, you had to walk or ride a donkey. And so I believe that there was occasion for that keeper of stinking sheep by night and gatherer of figs by day to frequent the farmer's market on occasion, but this was a different calling. This was something that God had done in his life, and he responded to the call. There were two truths that we talked about. The first one was about the man himself. God can use anyone that's available and any heart that's open. You don't have to go to seminary. You don't have to be a pastor or a missionary. You can simply be obedient to the very call of God and the command of Scripture. And here's a man that, from everything I read, and there's not a whole lot given outside of the book of Amos about him, he prophesied around 750 BC. His prophecy was concerning a future judgment. It brings me to my second truth, and that's about the man's message. Anytime that God is going to judge, there's always a warning. The next great judgment of God will be the tribulation. After we are raptured, thankfully, the tribulation will be God's judgment. Not his final judgment, but his judgment. Unlike anything that the world has ever seen. And I'm glad that I'm on the right side of those things. I hope that you are also. I thought, in lieu of what I saw happening this week, I thought, I might need to put Amos on hold. I might need to hold him back a week, and I might need to deal with current events, because there are probably some church members that want to make some sense out of all this. And I know there's a whole host of people that are confused and they're conflicted about what happened to a man by the name of George Floyd. What's happening to our country. 1 week, we're all in this together. And the next week, we're rioting in the streets, crying out about injustice, and we want justice. And then, if it wasn't bad enough, we had to rehash over the kneeling during the national anthem. And so I thought about this. I thought, maybe I should just put Amos aside and deal with those current events, because I'm certain there are some people they want some answers. And then I got back into the book of Amos. You know how it is that sometimes you have a gift and you're real anxious to give that gift and you just can't wait? I'm kind of like that, yeah. I can't wait for birthdays and anniversaries, and I'm ready. I want to be able to give that gift. And it's an amazing thing to be able to give something. Most of the time, those gifts are received. This is one of those times. Now, I come to the pulpit every Sunday amazed at what God has done and what he's doing in the Word. Continually, I am amazed. And for the most part, I believe that those messages are received. Occasionally, they're not. Yeah, it's as though when you give a gift that you've put some time and effort in and that gift is rejected or it doesn't fit, or it's something that happens that lessens not so much the heart that gave it, but the gift itself. This might be that day. Some of you are going to love it. Some of you are going to tolerate it, and I can guarantee you some of you are going to hate it. But it's going to come irregardless. We know that Amos's message was for a particular season. It was for a particular time in Israel's life. There were some things that Israel had let slide. They were prosperous. They were living in the height of riches. And underneath their nose, some of their brethren were living in poverty. They were unheard. No one was listening. There were needy. Some of those needy were taken advantage of, and they were sold into households to be men servants and maids, and some were even sold into sexual slavery. In Amos chapter 5, he begins to talk about this message from God to Israel. And as I began to read that message, and as I began to put two and two together, and I thought about the things that we're faced with right now, I thought, this is exactly the right time for Amos. It could not have come at a better time. The title of this morning's message is this: And Justice for All. Black lives matter. All lives matter. When there is social injustice, I think that, speaking for my contemporaries and some of my peers, we get a little nervous. When we start talking about social injustice and we begin to talk about humanitarian effort, I think that some of us theologically think that we're compromising. You're going to find out today that is far from the truth. I'm going to kind of give you the essence of the message, and then I'm going to develop it. Amos was preaching to a group of people that were attending church regularly. I mean, they were in temple. They regarded the Sabbath. They kept the Sabbath. They were almost religious in their sacrifices. They offered them up to God. They were continually doing those things. But they were guilty of several things. Of all of the immorality and of all of the idolatry and of the things that were going on in the house of Israel, there were also some things that God saw. Now, in America, we would like to keep God out of the conversation, wouldn't we? There are some people that think that when you begin to talk about social injustice, that God just needs to take a back seat. I mean, this isn't your arena. You really don't have much to say about this. I'm going to show you this morning that that is the contrary. That is on the contrary. Because, and here's the theme, how you treat other people is a reflection of what you think of God. Now, for you theologians, my brethren, my peers, I will make a distinction between the brotherhood of man and the brotherhood of God, and you'll see that there is a distinction made. But I thought that with all the confusion and all the hype and all the misinformation that's out there, maybe we could learn something from the book of Amos. Maybe we could learn something from that Old Testament common man who just kind of stepped forth and said, okay, God, here's this gift. They're not going to like it. How'd you like to be a prophet? How'd you like to be one of those prophets that had this message, this glimmer of gold and hope from God that you were going to share with people, and they would shut the door in your face? They wouldn't come out and hear you, or worse than that, they would try to stone you. Well, Amos was no dummy. And so he began to set the people up. And, my grandparents, and I'm old enough, and some of you that are watching may be old enough to remember the old hand pumps we didn't really have running water. My grandfather was a constable in Kentucky. I remember as a child getting a bath in a number 9 wash tub. And there was a hand pump. And there by that hand pump, there was usually a little pitcher of water. And often my grandmother Agnes would have to take, and she'd have to prime that pump in order to get the water to flow. And she'd pour that water down that pump, and she'd pump, and before long, it'd come gushing out. Well, that's what Amos does. He knows that this message is not going to just be received. It's a tough message to have to preach it, let alone receive it. So in chapter 1, he starts by dealing with the surrounding nations. In chapter 1, verse 3, he begins to talk about Damascus, and there's a familiar language that he uses for several verses. Thus saith the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Damascus, and for 4, I will not turn away the punishment thereof, because they have threshed Gilead with threshing instruments of iron. And he goes on to speak in verse 6 of Gaza, and verse 9 of Tyre, and in verse 11 of Edom, and in verse 13 of Ammon, and verse number 1 of chapter 2. He speaks of Moab, and then he does something. He's speaking about all of the surrounding nations. And isn't America great when we can talk about everybody else's problem? When we can turn CNN or Fox on and we can see how bad they got it in Ethiopia. Or when we can see that they're rioting in London. They've got real problems in Moscow. But this week I turned the tube on and I saw we got problems right here. And I thought, Amos, what do you got to say to that? So, Amos begins in chapter 2 of verse 4, thus saith the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Judah, getting a little closer to home now, and yea, for 4, I will not turn away the punishment thereof, because they have despised the law of the Lord, and have not kept his commandments, and their lies caused them to error, after the which their fathers have walked. But I will send a fire upon Judah, and I shall devour the palaces of Jerusalem. It's getting close to home, isn't it? In 722 BC, Assyria would invade the northern tribe of Israel. Just a few years later, Nebuchadnezzar will invade Judah. These things will happen. In less than 30 years, these prophecies will come to pass. So, he's primed the pump. Water's flowing. And in verse number 6, he goes on. Thus saith the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Israel, and for 4, I will not turn away the punishment thereof, because they have sold the righteous for silver, and the poor for a pair of shoes, that pant after the dust of the earth on the head of the poor, and turn away the meek, those that are unheard, the voices of those that cannot speak for themselves. And a man and his father will go unto the same maid to profane my holy name. And they lay themselves down upon clothes laid to pledge by every altar, and they drink the wine of the condemned in the house of their God, little g. And then he gives some examples of other nations that he destroyed for those same actions. America's got problems. We're all in this together. Until the tragic death of George Floyd. And there's rioting on the streets. and we turn a deaf ear and a blind eye to what's going on right in front of us. I think before I get any farther into the message, I need to make a case for certain definitions. The cry is for justice. And the cry against is for injustice. By definition, justice is, pay close attention. By definition, justice is the concept or perception of moral fairness, the administration of the law based upon the concepts or perceptions of, now pay attention, morality, ethics, God, equity, and fairness. The application of the law, or what we call due process. Now, if the cry is for injustice, and we want justice because of George Floyd, and we understand what the term is, then I'm for that. But hey, I think that justice is on the table. Now, if you're crying out for judgment, that's different. Judgment would say, let's take them out and let's hang them without due process. I don't know about what you saw, but what I saw in the streets, let's take them out and hang them. They are becoming like the very thing they say they hate. Time out. Prejudice is to prejudge something. Is there prejudice in America? Yeah. Prejudice is to take an action, to have a thought towards somebody based upon a preconceived idea about their ethnicity, their ethnic background, race, creed, color. Maybe you just don't like them. I had a guy in the 6th grade that wanted to fight me all the time. It was all I could do to avoid that guy. One day I decided that I was just going to face this guy down, and so I did. I stood there in the hallway and I said, will you stop and tell me why you constantly want to fight me? You know what he said? I just don't like you. Can you imagine that? Anybody not liking me? I just don't like you. I think it's only fair, and I don't know where this is in my notes. We're off the page. We're on uncharted territory. I think that we have to understand some things about those definitions. It is not fair. It is not right for anyone to paint all law enforcement with the same paintbrush that's used to paint those that murdered George Floyd. That's not fair. For the most part, men and women of law enforcement take their oaths very seriously. They are men and women of integrity. Are there a few rotten apples in the barrel? You bet you. Now hold on, because that you might like. You might not like this next part. It is also not fair or just for me to paint all peaceful demonstrators and protesters with the same paintbrush that I paint those that I saw on CNN. Because they're not saying the same thing. There are those that use as an excuse as to what happened to George Floyd to pillage, plunder, and to take advantage of a system that, quite frankly, we didn't know how to handle. We turned the deaf ear and a blind eye to what was going on in America, because now they have a voice and they're within their right to protest. Yes. What happened to we're all in this together? What happened to due process? Judgment, by definition, is the evaluation of evidence to make a decision, to the carrying out of a sentence. If what you mean by justice for George Floyd is, let's go through due process, I'm for that. If what you mean is because he's black, let's take those white men out and let's hang them by their neck, then I don't agree with that. And I don't apologize for it. Now, I've never met him, but what resurfaced, because now we have I hate it when people cow down and are cowards because they really and truly believe in something and then they renege on that. Oh, did I just use a word? I must be prejudiced. No, I'm not. Not a prejudiced bone in my body. If you only knew what we've had to endure over 40 years of ministry. In construction, there are several goals. Those goals, especially if you're a carpenter, those goals happen to be, we want to make things straight, plumb. That's a plumb bob. We want to build our project in such a way that it's straight, it's square, and it's level. Do you know that some of the hardest things to achieve in construction is to get a building that's straight, square, and level? Now, we have these inside jokes. I used to paint, and I never have been a good carpenter. I've never really seen a good carpenter that was a great painter, and every trade has an inside joke about another trade. We used to, as painters, we used to say, yeah, I'll leave it to the painter to fix what the carpenter messed up. It's not straight, it's not square, it's not level, but the painter will fix it. And then the carpenter used to say, leave it to the painter to find a problem. God told Amos, I want you to preach this message in such a way that we're going to deal with what we would call social injustice. We're going to deal with those that are not heard. We're going to deal with those meek. We're going to deal with those less fortunate. We're going to deal with those that are being taken advantage of. In essence, Amos had to go in front of a people and say, you would sell your brother for a pair of sandals. We have politicians that'll sell out for a vote. What we have is an America that wants to pick and choose their morality. We want to say that, yeah, we're for injustice and we want justice for George Floyd. But have you seen some of the ads lately on television? And yet, dare I speak about same-sex marriage in such a way that it would offend? All lives matter, and they all matter to God. But this business of picking and choosing what morality we choose, what we choose to believe, and what we choose to do about what we believe is not working. The lawmaker says, let's make more laws. Law enforcement says, give me the authority and the power to enforce those laws. The politician says it needs to start in the White House. The people just cry out it needs to start somewhere. God told Amos, preach this message. You ready? Here it goes. And I realize I'm not going to get through with this today. In chapter 5, he gives the gist of this message. He says in verse 21, I hate, this is God speaking, I hate and I despise your feast days. I will not smell in your solemn assemblies. Do you know what God was saying? Your holy days stink. You stink in your worship of me. Why do we stink? Why is our attempt at worship? You say, you mean those people in the northern kingdom, the northern tribe of Israel were going to church, they were going to temple? Yeah. They were holding holy feasts and holy days, and they were offering sacrifices. He says, though ye offer me burnt offerings and meat offerings, I will not accept them. Neither will I regard the peace offerings of your fat beasts. Take thou away from me the noise of thy songs, for I will not hear the melody of thy viols. But let judgment, in a lot of translations it is the word justice, but let justice run down as waters and righteousness as a mighty stream. Ye have offered unto me sacrifices and offerings in the wilderness 40 years, O house of Israel. In other words, you go to church, you give me these offerings, and they stink. Why do they stink? You're probably not going to like why they stink. They stink because if you're following along with me in verse 11, you tread upon the poor, you take from him burdens of wheat, you've built houses of hewn stone. In essence, you live in an ivory palace while your neighbor lives in a dung heap. You've planted pleasant vineyards, but ye shall not drink the wine of them. You bribe, you lie, you scatter the poor, and those that are meek and unheard go unheard. Now, I'm going to close with this. I hope it gives you a little bit of a cliffhanger to tune in next week. If for nothing else, if you're mad at me, maybe you'll get glad with me by next week. I don't know him, but my son played football against him in high school. Drew Brees came out this week because what resurfaced, because now everybody's got a voice, and he reiterated what he had said before. I will not be for anybody disgracing or showing anything but allegiance to the flag and our country. A few days later, he apologized for his insensitivity. Now, he has the right to apologize, and if this somehow makes its way, I don't know why it would, but if it makes its way into Drew Brees' living room, I don't think I'll have anything to apologize for. Days later, it's as though a light came on. Oh, yeah, I was insensitive. Maybe that was. I don't know. It's never been about the flag. There's a saying, and I'm going to dummy it down, and I'm going to clean it up for church. Don't pour water down my neck and tell me it's raining. I was born at night, just not last night. If it's never been about the flag, hey, I got something for you, then don't kneel during the ceremony. You remember what justice is by definition and judgment is by definition? It's the perception of moral values. It's evidenced, and those evidences lead to a judgment call. Apparently, there were a lot of people in America that thought it was about the American flag. I got a novel idea for you. Kneel down somewhere else. I don't pay to watch you kneel down while the American flag is being brought out. The way I understand it, Jerry Jones doesn't either. High five. You go, well, where will we kneel down? Oh, I don't know. Let's try a novel idea here. How about going into a restaurant and before you eat, kneel down? There are a lot of places you can kneel down. If it's not about the American flag, then don't make it about the American flag. Next week, I'm going to give you what I believe is the solution to America's problem. That's next week.